Imagine this. The world just holding its collective breath, everyone glued to the news as two neighbors, both armed with nuclear weapons, are right there on the edge of a full-blown war. That terrifying picture, well, it came incredibly close to reality just this past June 18th, 2025, in South Asia. Thankfully, a surprising de-escalation pulled things back, and you could almost hear the global sigh of relief. That moment, that chilling closeness to potential catastrophe where the stakes were just, well, almost unimaginable. That's what we're diving into today. We're going to unpack those incredibly tense 4 days of conflict between India and Pakistan, the ceasefire that suddenly emerged, and importantly, the very different stories about who actually made the peace happen. And this isn't just dry geopolitics we're talking about. It's about the real human cost, the people involved, and that razor-thin line between diplomacy working and, frankly, disaster striking. So as we go through this, you'll get the backstory, the deep historical roots of the tension, the specific spark that lit this latest fire, and just how fast it all spiraled to a point where nuclear weapons were definitely casting a long shadow.
We'll look really carefully at the different angles on the ceasefire. Washington loudly taking credit, New Delhi flatly denying anyone else mediated, and Islamabad actually thanking the U.S. It's quite a contrast.
It really is. And the sheer speed of it all, how quickly it escalated, that tells you something crucial. You've got these long-standing historical issues, contested land like Kashmir, and it creates this feedback loop. A single incident can suddenly bypass all the usual diplomatic checks and balances, pushing nuclear states towards the brink much faster than I think many people realize. To really understand this near miss, we do need to step back a bit to how this all started.
Right. Let's unpack that history for a moment. India and Pakistan, their rivalry goes way back to 1947, doesn't it? The partition of the British Empire, a messy, hurried affair, to put it mildly. And the big, unresolved issue hanging over everything is Kashmir. It's been this constant source of friction, the trigger for past wars, decades of tension, and Kashmir is still the flashpoint. Emotionally, ideologically, it's right at the center.
Exactly. Kashmir isn't just territory. It's like an open wound for both countries, embodying all those historical grievances. And then on April 22nd this year, 2025, that simmering tension just boiled over, tragically.
So that brings us to the immediate trigger for this latest round. What happened on April 22nd?
A terrorist attack took place in Pahalgam. It's usually a beautiful scenic valley in Indian-administered Kashmir. 26 tourists were killed. A terrible incident.
And India's reaction was immediate.
Yes, immediate accusation leveled at Pakistan, saying they backed the militants who carried it out. Pakistan just as quickly denied any involvement, a very firm denial.
And just like that, the familiar pattern starts again. Accusations, denials, and the rhetoric starts ratcheting up fast.
Very fast. By May 7th, things escalated dramatically. India launched Operation Sindoor. That involved a series of airstrikes targeting what they called terror camps inside Pakistan and also Pakistan-administered Kashmir. It was a very clear signal, a demonstration of India's willingness to use significant military force across the border.
And Pakistan wasn't going to just absorb that, presumably?
No, absolutely not. They retaliated with their own strikes, and then suddenly you had drones, missiles, fighter jets, all active, engaging each other across the line of control. That de facto border in Kashmir, it became really the most intense fighting that two countries had seen in decades. A genuinely frightening situation unfolding in real time.
And this is where the nuclear angle becomes impossible to ignore, right?
Precisely. That's the terrifying backdrop to all of this. Both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. India's estimated around 160 warheads. Pakistan maybe slightly more, around 170. So this fighting from May 7th to May 10th wasn't just some minor border clash. It was a hot conflict between two nuclear-armed states.
Was there a specific moment that felt particularly dangerous?
There was. Intelligence reports, they suggested that a Pakistani airbase in Rawalpindi was actually hit by Indian strikes. Now, Rawalpindi is very close to Pakistan's nuclear command infrastructure. That detail alone just sends a chill down your spine. It highlights the incredible risk of miscalculation, how a conventional fight could, potentially spiral very, very quickly into something unthinkable.
Yeah, the proximity, it's startling. It shows how conventional actions near those sensitive sites could just shrink the decision time, increasing the chance of a catastrophic mistake. But then, almost as quickly as it flared up, it stopped. May 10th, after those 4 intense days, they agreed to a full and immediate ceasefire.
Which brings us to the really fascinating part, the competing stories about how that ceasefire actually happened.
Right. Let's start with the U.S. narrative. It was very public, very loud. President Trump announced it almost immediately on Truth Social, didn't he?
He did. Claimed credit for a historic and heroic decision were his words, I believe. Yes. And then later, on June 18th, while praising the leaders of India and Pakistan as very smart, he also hosted Pakistan's Army Chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, for lunch at the White House.
That lunch was significant, wasn't it? Just the Army chief, no civilian officials.
Extremely significant. It was reportedly the first time a U.S. president hosted Pakistan's top military leader quite like that, without the civilian government counterparts present. It really underscored a direct military-to-military channel that the U.S. seemed to be emphasizing.
So Trump's taking credit publicly, but what was happening behind the scenes? Was the U.S. actually involved?
Oh, definitely. Behind the public statements, there was clearly a concerted diplomatic push. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called Munir on May 9th. The next day, Vice President J.D. Vance spoke with India's Prime Minister Modi. U.S. officials were, according to reports, genuinely spooked by how bad things could get, especially after that reported strike near Rawalpindi.
So it sounds like real pressure was being applied.
It seems so. The U.S., along with allies like the U.K. and Saudi Arabia, were leaning on both sides. There was talk of potential economic leverage. Pakistan, for example, desperately needed an IMF loan, and the U.S. holds a lot of influence there. And the carrot was possibly on the table, too, things like improved trade deals. Trump himself hinted at this kind of thing during that lunch with Munir. It shows how economic vulnerability can be a powerful diplomatic tool these days.
Okay, so that's the U.S. perspective, or at least the one they presented. But India, they had a completely different story.
Completely different. Very firm pushback against any idea of outside mediation. India's Foreign Secretary, Vikram Misri, gave a video statement quite pointedly from Canada, where Modi was at the G7 summit. He stated very clearly that the ceasefire came from direct talks between the Indian and Pakistani military operations directors, the DGMOs. And crucially, he said Pakistan initiated those talks.
And he explicitly ruled out U.S. involvement.
Explicitly, he said, quote, "No discussion at any level on an India-U.S. trade deal or any proposal for mediation." Crystal clear.
And this fits India's long-standing position, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Modi apparently reiterated this in a 35-minute call with Trump on June 17th. India's stance for decades has been, Kashmir is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. No third parties needed or wanted. Misri even mentioned complete political consensus in India on this matter. It's a core principle for them, tied up with sovereignty and their view of Kashmir as integral territory. External involvement is just seen as interference.
So India's saying thanks, but no thanks, we handle this ourselves, while the U.S. is claiming a major diplomatic win. What about Pakistan's reaction?
Pakistan was the complete opposite of India. They publicly welcomed the U.S. role. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif actually thanked Washington for its leadership and proactive role for peace in the region.
A stark contrast indeed.
A very stark contrast. Pakistan even declared May 11th a Yumi Tashakur, a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the truce. Prayers, tributes to the military, the whole thing. For Pakistan, this wasn't just about stopping the fighting. It seemed to also signal a warming of ties with the U.S., which is strategically important for them, maybe as a counterweight to regional influences like Iran and China. There were hints Iran was even discussed during that Trump-Munir lunch.
So 3 very different narratives about the same event. Fascinating. The ceasefire was agreed, but how stable was it in those initial hours and days? Did it actually hold?
Well, it was shaky right from the start. Within hours, India accused Pakistan of violating it with artillery fire in Kashmir. Pakistan denied it, blamed India instead. The usual pattern, unfortunately. And the reality on the ground for civilians was tough. Warnings about unexploded shells near the border, a power plant damaged in Uri, India, needing repairs, families displaced in Kurata, Pakistan, waiting anxiously to go home.
And the military posturing didn't stop either.
Not at all. India's military leaders held a press conference in Delhi on May 11th, warning Pakistan against any more violations. Prime Minister Modi vowed impactful action against terrorism, whether it was, as he put it, on this side of the border or across. Strong words.
And Pakistan.
Pakistan's military was doing damage control, spinning their own narrative. They claimed they lost no aircraft, while alleging India lost 5, which India didn't confirm, by the way. They also made a big deal about supposedly taking out an Indian S-400 air defense system. Both sides were really trying hard to shape the story for their own people, to claim victory even as things were calming down. That information war continues long after the shooting stops.
Let's talk about the political side in India. Was there concern that Trump taking credit might, affect Modi's image?
There certainly seemed to be. Reports suggested the Indian government was worried. Trump's narrative undermined Prime Minister Modi's carefully cultivated image as a strong, decisive leader, especially with his nationalist base. You saw quotes from supporters, like one in Lucknow, saying, "We voted for a strong man, and he has proved himself." That perception matters hugely, and Trump's offer to mediate on Kashmir has always been a sensitive issue, a sore point, as some reports called it, given India's absolute insistence that Kashmir is internal and bilateral only.
So domestic politics really shaped India's public stance on the ceasefire mediation.
Absolutely. It made them very resistant to any story that suggested they needed outside help to de-escalate. For Pakistan, though, welcoming U.S. involvement seemed to offer a diplomatic win. But, and this is crucial, the ceasefire didn't solve anything fundamental. The core Kashmir dispute is still there. The Indus Waters Treaty, which India had suspended access to during the fighting, a huge issue for Pakistan's water supply that wasn't resolved either. So it was a pause, but the underlying problems are still very much live.
So, stepping back, what's the bigger picture here? What does this whole episode tell us?
Well, first, a stark reminder of the real cost. This wasn't just diplomatic chess. At least 66 people died, thousands were displaced, millions lost in damages. We can't forget the human impact.
Absolutely.
And second, that hidden danger we talked about, the strikes near nuclear command sites, it really highlights just how fragile peace is, how easily miscalculation could lead to catastrophe when nuclear weapons are in the mix. It's a global warning, really.
It also seemed to cement the U.S. role, didn't it? Even if they were initially reluctant.
It did. You had Vice President Vance reportedly saying it was none of our business, but then barely a day later, he's on the phone to Modi. Why? Because when two nuclear powers start exchanging actual fire, it affects global stability. The U.S., with its influence, finds it almost impossible not to get involved, even if it doesn't want to. It showed they're still, in many ways, the indispensable nation when things get truly dangerous between nuclear states.
And what about India's position? It seems complex.
Very complex. India is clearly a rising power, the world's fifth largest economy, flexing its muscles with those cross-border strikes under Modi. But the quick ceasefire also, perhaps, showed some limits or vulnerabilities. Critics certainly raise questions about whether the operation achieved its aims or if it was cut short due to pressure. It highlights that balancing act between projecting strength and managing domestic and international reactions.
Which brings us back to that sense of a repeating cycle.
Exactly. The fundamental issues Kashmir, the historical mistrust, water disputes, they remain completely unresolved. So the region just seems stuck in this pattern of building tension, near crisis, de-escalation, and then back to simmering tension. As one Pakistani analyst put it quite bluntly, every few years, we're back at the brink.
It's a worrying cycle.
It is, because while stopping the fighting is always good, this peace feels more like just hitting pause. Without tackling the root causes, the risk of another flare-up, maybe one that spirals further next time, just keeps growing.
So where do things stand now, as of June 19th, 2025?
The ceasefire's holding, thankfully, but it feels fragile. Both countries are dealing with the aftermath, repairing damage, managing the political fallout, and reasserting their positions.
And regardless of who gets the credit in the history books, you have to acknowledge that the leaders in both India and Pakistan did manage to step back from what could have been an absolutely catastrophic outcome.
Yeah,
They pulled back from the abyss.
they did. That decision deserves recognition.
So thinking about all this, the history, the recent crisis, the competing narratives, it leaves us with the big question, doesn't it, for you, the listener, to mull over. Was this de-escalation just another temporary truce in a long, bitter rivalry, maybe forced by outside pressure? Or could it, maybe, be seen differently, as a sort of, well, pragmatic if messy blueprint for how nuclear neighbors can pull back from the edge, even when the core problems aren't solved? What might that mean for other dangerous flashpoints around the world where deep disputes seem impossible to resolve?